Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are moving on from our discussion of African Americans to looking at Asian Americans. Um, don't let the name fool you. Asian American is used to describe a large group of people who are from so many different nationalities. So, when you think of the census, when they use Asian or Pacific Islander, they're referring to the people who are on the Pacific Islands. So we're talking about Hawaii, Guam. We're also talking about immigrant groups, right? And Asian Americans are the ethnic group that are primarily immigrant. And so we are looking at, like I said, a large group, primarily foreign born, and also quite a bit different than any of the other minority groups that we have discussed before. So one of the things that I should note is that even though Hispanics are the largest minority group and they're growing in terms of numbers, they seem to be getting bigger and bigger. Actually, Asian Americans are a much faster growing group, but the primary source of this population is from immigration. Actually, this group, like I said, is primarily foreign born, like I said, and not only that, but they are also more educated than most other immigrant groups. Over 70%, based on the last census, come into the U.S. already with a bachelor's degree. And so we're talking about a more educated group, which means they are more likely to command higher than average disposable incomes. And also, Census 2010 data will show that Asian Americans do have above national average disposable income. But in terms of countries, like I said, it is very diverse. We're talking about China, Japan, Korea, and of course, we know that there are two different Koreas, right? North and South. We know that. We're also including in that group people from Pakistan, from India, from Indonesia, and so there are multiple cultures wrapped up in this group. And so when we say Asian American, like I said before, we're referring to a really large group, a really diverse group. And because of that diversity, it requires that marketers are very specific about what group within the Asian American group they are trying to target. Because clearly for this group, more than any other group, it is going to the way that you target this group will be different depending on what country of origin you are looking at, right? So that's just something that we want to establish from the outset. This is an extremely diverse group, right? In terms of where they live, we're seeing where Western U.S. is huge, especially for California. So we see San Francisco and LA as two of the larger DMAs. But when we talk about Hawaii, so we have Honolulu as one of those cities that they're in. We also have Chicago and also New York. We know that New York is probably one of the most diverse cities in the U.S. Even though I just preface this conversation by saying that this group is much more diverse than others, by and large, there are a few unifying factors that make it possible from a values and cultural perspective to target this group as, or at least most of this group as, with similar messaging. Okay, so we're talking about family and group orientation. We have discussed individualism versus collectivism. We find that most of these countries will be on the collectivist side of things, so most of the countries of origin, and so that whole family orientation is going to be very strong within these specific groups. And so this is one of those unifying factors. And remember, when we talk about unifying factors, we're talking about from a cultural perspective in terms of making that emotional connection. We may be able to use that to reach multiple groups. But again, in terms of specialized campaigns, we still recommend that you try to figure out what group you are trying to target primarily in terms of country of origin and focus on that. So just to kind of qualify this conversation so that we all understand that even though there are unifying factors, we still require more specialized campaigns, especially if we're going to be doing, depending on the type of targeting, depending on the type of messaging that you're using, right? Okay, so let's go back to the unifying factors. So we have family, right, or that group orientation. We also have education, right, that value for saving. That is something that is also very highly valued. Okay, so those are some of the unifying factors. So going back to the whole family orientation, what we find is that family is very important in these groups, right? And family may be more important in most cases than individuals. And so we are talking about more highly collectivist groups, right? And in addition to that, we also have a lot of these cultures being extremely masculine. And what I mean by being masculine is that gender roles are very clearly defined. There are very clear hierarchies in not just the larger society, but even within the family. And so gender roles are very clearly defined. So fathers do, the male role does have some amount of authority, final decision-making power when it comes to certain very important decisions. And so these are very masculine cultures. Not only does masculinity speak to gender roles, but we also see some amount of preference for brand name products because those brands tend to indicate place in society. It tends to indicate prestige, and so there is a preference for brands. But I will go into consumption a little bit later. But again, just to kind of say, masculinity as a whole is not just about gender roles, but it also has a preference for indicating place in society, and consumption is used to do that. Okay, and there is that whole sense of interdependency. So members of the family together are considered to be important to each other, right? And because of this importance of not just family but also community, we find that from the marketing implication perspective, organizations' values are extremely important. They pay very close attention to the values of the organizations. They have very strong ties, not just to communities in their countries of origin. And so these groups are more likely to go back to visit, depending on the countries that they're from, if they have the ability to do so and the resources, they're more likely to do that. But they're also very strongly connected to their communities within the U.S. So the Chinese American community, the Filipino American community. So they have strong connections, not just to home country, but also the community within the U.S., members of their national culture, and they are probably more likely to be tasked with keeping the values of these countries alive, and they tend to be more loyal to companies that make an effort to connect with those communities that are primarily based around country of origin, but here in America, right? And so again, their identities are very dual. There is connection to home, but there's also connection to the community within the U.S. So as I said, education is definitely also one of the unifying factors. Education is extremely important in most Asian American communities. Most of these countries of origin, education is seen as very important. These children are normally, they tend to have higher exam anxiety. They are more likely to be in extra classes, special programs that are more academic, right? And so we see that connection between that importance and the amount of resources that parents are willing to dedicate to their education. We see that being correlated with the high levels of degree attainment in these communities, and clearly that will go on to be correlated to disposable income, right? And so we can see where and how these groups tend to have this higher disposable income, and it's partially because of this this focus on education and making sure that these children attain, and this is something that parents do dedicate significant amount of their resources to. The other part of it is also about saving. These, even though saving as a whole in America in terms of averages is going down, in this community, there is a large focus on saving. And we have just talked about education, and this is a part of it. Most parents will be saving, not just for short term, but for long term, for their children's education, for all the extra activities that they want to see their children in, right? This culture is also very future oriented. And if you are future oriented, then you are more likely to be saving for the future. This community or this group is also, they also have high uncertainty avoidance. So they want to save for a rainy day. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. You want to make sure that you are prepared, right? So they are less likely to engage in risky financial decisions. They are more likely to save their funds. They are more likely to be prepared for any eventualities in the future. As I was saying before, in terms of consumption, what do some of these cultural values, what are the implications of some of these cultural values for this group? We find, like I said, because of the very masculine culture and also because of, again, high uncertainty avoidance, they are more attracted to known brand names that signify certain things, right? But in addition to that, we see where the immigrant groups are more likely to seek out American brands that they would have been familiar with back in their home country. And so we find that transfer of loyalty to brands that they would have known home here in the US. And so that is something that we see. One thing that I would want to point out is that even though there is this preference or loyalty for brands, there is also some amount of thriftiness in this community. And so there is a balance. They don't want to pay more than something is worth, right? And so they're more likely to be attracted by sales. They will go to a store that they were not normally going to just to be able to take advantage of lower prices. So retail, outlet shopping, for those premium brands we will see. So just so you know, even though they do want those premium brands, they are also thrifty, meaning they're not willing to pay more than they feel these brands are worth. And so they will be looking for discounts. They will be looking for prices that they feel are fair, right? So that is one thing that we should be very aware of when it comes to this community. In terms of challenges, we are all, I think, familiar with some of the stereotypes that come along with being Asian, right? Because, again, Asians don't look American. And so that is something that stays with them forever, pretty much. And so I don't know if you've ever seen that YouTube video where it's like, where are you from? And the person would be like, oh, I'm from California. And it's like, no, where are you really from? So even though this person may be able to trace his or her roots in America back 2 or 3 generations because of their physical appearance, they are still stuck with this very immigrant perception of them by the general public. And so people are still always wondering, where are you from? Where's your family from? Right? This group also continues to be underrepresented in terms of their portrayals in media, in terms of advertising spend towards this group, where we see where, even marginal amounts are being spent on these groups, right? And not only that, but we also see stereotypes, right? We see the geeky, smart kid who is awesome at math, right? Because that's how people perceive this group, right? And in many instances, the types of businesses that they own, restaurants and laundry shops, that's how they're portrayed. Again, this comes back to stereotypes that were not just African American stereotypes or Hispanic stereotypes, but Asian American stereotypes as well. They are very pervasive. The Asian American group is also considered that model minority. Model minority meaning educated, more likely to be married, not engage in premarital sex, have larger extended family, have this high educational attainment, don't get into trouble. These model citizens. And while we might say, okay, stereotypes are supposed to be bad, portray negative things about a group, this is a burden to every single member of the Asian American community, because then it is this box or this space that we are trying to confine this group to. And people will tell you, I am not your model minority. I am me. I am different. And so that whole stressing of difference, that whole need for individuality, and being able to understand that a Japanese person is completely different from a Chinese person, who is completely different from a North Korean or a South Korean or an Indian or a Pakistani. Cultures are so different. And again, because of the diversity that is in this group, it brings along with it all of these challenges. From a cultural perspective, we also have that legacy from that very collectivist culture where they're perceived as not being very assertive, not being very confident, unsure of themselves. And that is definitely something that the newer generation, the further we go out in terms of generation in the U.S., being here in American culture, we see where that has been changing and continues to change. But of course, what they have in common is the whole immigrant experience of their parents, right? Trying to adjust to life in America, still dealing with those expectations that are strongly rooted in home country culture. But then these children are born here in the U.S., they're raised in a different culture, they are pretty much in between worlds. And so there's a lot of tension in this group. I'm hoping that you guys have had a chance to read the chapters. Please, if you haven't, go ahead and do so. Like I said, this class, the material that we cover is not intuitive. If you haven't read, if you're not keeping up with the readings, you are probably going to have a harder time than others moving along in this course or doing well in this course. Please note, like I said before, in terms of statistics, we want to go to the most recent census data, because these books will give you statistics that show you what the picture was probably in the 2000 census all the way up to 2005, 2007, if the data was available then. But we are now in almost 10 years later. We do need current information. Go to the American Community Surveys. The Census Bureau has press releases that they issue about, current numbers in terms of population percentage, education, all of that. You can find that, and that is going to be particularly important for your assignment for this week, because this week you get to choose and you have to do a PowerPoint presentation similar to the one that you did on Hispanics. And this time you get to choose between either Asian Americans or African Americans. But we go through that same process. We look at the current statistics. Bear in mind, if you haven't looked at my feedback for that last graphic presentation, and graphic presentation means PowerPoint presentation, everything has to be on your slide. Do not use any notes because I won't see the notes, right? I don't download your assignments. I grade them directly on Blackboard, so anything in your notes will not be seen. Please go ahead and make sure that you're using current data, answer all the questions, and make sure that you provide those 5 implications at the very end. Use citations on each slide. So whether you want to use superscripts 1, 2, 3, 4, number them, and then put the complete reference in the footnotes, or you want to use parenthetical references and then provide the complete list at the end. You do need to provide references on slides and at the end. References are extremely important. This is how you do not plagiarize somebody else's work. You give credit to the person who originally found the data. Again, please don't use InfoPlease, Wikipedia, any of these sources, because again, the primary source of this information, the organizations that are really tasked with and spend a lot of time doing primary research on these populations, Pew, the U.S. Census Bureau, Nielsen, and even Nielsen cites the Census Bureau. So again, go back to primary sources. Newspaper articles are not primary sources. They talk about something that somebody else has done. Please, again, go to primary sources for your information. Outside of that, please send me an email if you have any questions. And of course, check out the course library for documents in terms of most recent reports on some of these groups. And see you next week. So take care.